Okay, so it is April 22nd, and we are up in New Braunfels for one of Teddy's soccer games. We've just had a fantastic steak and mashed potato dinner. I overdid the steaks a little bit, but we had a nice time. And Teddy opened his first bottle of champagne today and did a fantastic job. And let's see, what else? When we last left off, we had talked about gun shows, each of your kids, me and Jenny and Chris's college experiences. And I think what we had talked about is that y'all didn't have a lot of money while everybody was in school. But then after everybody got out of school, you all kind of started up your travels. And so I don't know that we're going to get to all of it tonight, but we talked about basically kind of three areas to talk about, maybe four. One is your consulting business, kind of your post-army and librarian careers. And then two, travels, kids travels, and retirement. So consulting, travels, kids travels, and retirement. Where do you want to start?
We're not retired.
Not retired yet.
I've gone through a number of career changes, but I'm still...
Let's talk about consulting, just because tell us about how that came about, how you got started. Because basically you are both running your own business, your own consulting business, and about how that came
Well, I
out.
had like 18 years with Texas Department of Health, and then it was Texas Department of Health and Human Services, and then it was all right, and at that time, you know, we had like 17 pharmacists around the state, and I was focusing in pharmacy, but they were moving more and more towards less pharmacy involvement because of the cost, and it seemed like a reasonable time to leave the state, and the retirement benefits and including health care were good. And I had developed, I think, a pretty solid reputation in the 9 counties that we inspected. There were 150 nursing homes. So Ruth and I sort of thought about the idea of a consulting business where we would help a home get ready for a survey or help them after a survey occurred and they had a number of compliance issues. And it was a great idea.
So give me an idea about when did the consulting business open, or when did you?
Okay, we retired
At 62 from my library job and the state. It was 2002.
2002, a year after 9/11.
And it was the summer of 2002. And we had thought about this for several months, and your father was well known in the field, knew therapy, drug therapy for the elderly, up and down, knew the regulations, so it was both clinical and regulatory that you had expertise in.
And so the business was Libby and Libby Consulting. And when you got started, how did you get businesses or nursing homes to hire you?
We did some marketing. We sent out letters saying that we were available to do consulting work, and I think we pretty much covered the 9-county area that you had worked in. And we were immediately busy.
At the height of the Libby and Libby Consulting, how many nursing homes were you inspecting?
They weren't regular. They called us when they had an investigation, if there was some problem, if they'd had a survey that there were deficiencies and they needed correction, or if they had questions. And we sent letters to every nursing home.
And then we picked up routine monthly consulting with John Wade and Legend Pharmaceuticals.
That's true.
We did Hondo.
And there were a number of places where they would have us once a year before the survey. So we would go to the facility, Neil would do a complete drug audit, tell them where the problems were, and we'd do a report before the state survey came.
So Dad did the kind of technical analysis, but what was your job what is
I
your
did
job?
when we started out heavy doing marketing, and I set up a database for drugs. It was antipsychotic
Informed consent
database, because there had to be consents for, the list is up to 95 drugs for the elderly, if the elderly are taking these, and you have to tell the drug, the side effects, the good effects, what the problems are. But anyway, we have a database for that. I did the spreadsheets for the business, keeping track of the income. One thing we did do when we started was, because Neil had heard this from an attorney who was in private practice, Jesse Gomez, who said the first thing he did when he set up his law practice was to hire an accountant. Because you have all kinds of tax issues. There are retirement benefits if you have a small business. I mean, you can do simple IRAs. So we did, I guess Gene Brem had done our taxes with the beach house for a number of years. But
on Chris's recommendation, actually.
yes. So he and I did the tax, or I did the monthly or the quarterly tax payments, and we had put in Social Security payments, which is kind of a problem. Or when you're self-employed, you have to pay the Social Security tax, et cetera, et cetera. So I did all of that, and I did type the reports, did Medline or searches, database searches if your dad had a question. It was my job to kind of keep up on what new drugs were coming out, or if there were any adverse effects, new adverse effects, just kind of keep your pulse on.
And drug information with the medical librarian was a nice fit.
Yeah.
And, we called it Libby and Libby Consulting, but it was absolutely a combination kind of job. I could not have done it without Ruth, so we worked together well.
But it was his expertise.
I'm sorry, but let me ask this. The Libbies are not big risk takers.
Yeah.
Just historically, we haven't been big risk takers, but when you look at the business, and would you have left the state and the library sooner to open up the consulting business? I mean, was it that successful, or?
What we did was just perfect. I think that there was a potential for me to set up a major business with multiple other consultants as staff members to provide a high level of consulting across long-term care. That would have been an option and probably financially rewarding. What we did was limited to just Ruth and I would say during the peak of it, we probably worked maybe 2 or 3 days a week, most weeks. And we picked up the Region Care, which has homes in El Paso, San Marcos, Laredo, 4 homes in San Antonio, and we would do quarterly visits for them. It was just one of those ideas that immediately moved to the point where we were comfortably busy, and then over the years it was sort of divided into thirds. A third of the business was the acute consulting from the dozen homes that would have us once a year. A third was Region Care, and then about 10 years ago we picked up the Eden account here in New Braunfels, which we do twice a month. And at this point we've sort of first dropped the dozen homes, and then dropped Region Care.
So-
and at this point, we have just Eden.
So let's just briefly, started 2001-ish, and now it's 2017, and it's kind of winding down. And you have basically one home left,
Yes.
and
And it worked out that way partly because about when we moved to New Braunfels, we stopped doing the marketing.
Absolutely.
So the people who were having us when they had a problem, that sort of died off, which was the intent. Because it got so driving to Kerrville and getting to Kerrville by 7 a.m. or driving to Uvalde or driving to Victoria. I mean,
Or downtown San Antonio.
right, it just got to be,
I know it's remarkable though, because the military career was 22, 23 years.
yes.
But the consulting career has been 16 or 17
Yeah, and
years.
the state was 18 or 19.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. So you've been doing that a long
You
time.
talked about risk. The consulting business that Ruth and I set up had about zero risk. We didn't buy inventory, we didn't set up an office, we didn't have staff. There's Ruth and I and a computer
And we could retire. We could have retired in '62 with the city and the state and the military retirement. But we're glad we didn't.
yeah,
And that's a good transition because
because
the
what it
consult-
generated was discretionary funds. And we were talking one time, your consulting business is a nice, hobby. And I said, well, that's about 60 grand a year. And my dear son said, well, that's a hell of a good hobby, And it did. It generated extra monies
Which we had been without for a long time.
with kids in college and houses and,
And the other side of the coin is we did talk about expanding and hiring pharmacists and setting up more of a corporation. But what we really had was your father's expertise. And anytime
and
we
no
hi-
management or
and no
personnel issues.
Issues, yes. So we talked about it, but we didn't, and I think it was a smart decision. Partly because we realized, talking to other companies, it was impossible to hire a pharmacist 10 or 15 years ago. We talked to somebody who wanted to hire a pharmacist, and they said that everybody in the class that graduated in June had a job in the fall.
many starting at, Walgreens, CVS, HEB, 105,000 a year. So,
That accentuates
Hiring
your risk.
Yeah.
and the consulting was very rewarding in that very rarely, whether it's what we've done this past weekend or 15 years ago, when we finished a consulting visit, we usually identified medication errors where the patient was getting the wrong med or the wrong dose or a med that hadn't been discontinued, the patient was still getting, or a new order that the patient wasn't getting. So it wasn't just regulatory, administrative stuff. When we got done, some elderly person's was in better shape clinically, quality of life because of our visit. And that was,
That's
that
great.
was and still is. I mean, we just went through it this weekend, same thing.
So that's fantastic. And then the bottom line is that the funds that were coming in and are coming in from consulting were used to fund travel. And I think when we had left off, I had graduated from law school, and I'm not sure if it was your first trip, but at some point you all came out to see us in Germany, and then you kind of reignited your traveling, whether it was the Yucatan or Costa Rica or Germany. So let's turn now to a little bit of some of your travels.
And, I think money spent on experiences. I look around the house and, you know, whether it's the bellows that we use to cook the steak or the piece of ceramics that we got at the Tongeren flea market, we have a lot of stuff and a lot of memories. But we had traveled or experienced with the grandchildren and children before. I mean, you visited me in Korea. Just you and I in an apartment in Korea. And we visited you in Germany, and then twice. And then I guess our very first trip, Neil was 11 or 12?
And I think 10.
10 maybe, and we went to New York City.
But I have to tell you.
And this is Chris's son, Neil.
Yes.
That was the first grandkid trip. But go ahead, Mom.
But
Sorry.
I just want to say that we got the idea from my great niece, Catherine Ruth, who is Teresa's daughter. Her grandmother, Eric Johnson's mom, had taken her on an 8th grade trip to New York City, I believe. And Catherine Ruth is very personable. She went with this group of Irene and her
Old ladies,
and they all had a wonderful time. And we thought, what a great idea.
And it started our getting apartments or flats or vacation rental by owner. And we got one of our very first apartments in New York City. And Neil had a wonderful time.
Well, tell me about that trip, because that was the trip that started all trips.
And it was, thank goodness for everybody else and us, it was very successful. He was 10, and if you saw those pictures, he was so young, but he was such a good traveler.
So how did you to wave down taxis? Neil, we need a taxi. He was out there waving.
That was pre-Uber, but how did so basically it started off with Neil, but it resulted in all of the other kids getting a trip, which ended up being more than one trip. But how did you decide on New York, and how did Neil decide on New York, and how did that come up?
I think we usually did some research and gave the kids 2 or 3 choices, and you would have to ask Neil and Chris. New York was one choice. Was Washington a choice?
And he had not been to New York before.
No, he had not.
And we had been there when we were stationed in New Jersey and went to Governor's Island, so we knew the city.
And then we had a wonderful trip with the sale of the painting, when Chris and Jenny went, and Barb and Teresa. And we stayed in the Trump Tower on West, whatever it was,
So we knew
67th
New York.
Street. So we knew New York. We knew New York. We'd been to Baltimore for another art trip. I had been to Washington a couple of times on library trips. We generally took the kids places we had been or were familiar with.
What was the highlight of Neil's trip in New York? Any plays or anything?
We saw The Lion King, which was wonderful.
We went to the big aircraft carrier that was in the harbor. It's not the Lexington, that's in Corpus. Went to the big aircraft carrier.
I forget what it is.
Wall and
They had a climbing wall, and they had the planes which you could see on deck. That was a great success.
It's funny because I don't know that we probably did talk about it because we've got a lot of tape, but that just brings me back to Governor's Island. Mm-hmm. And
we had so much fun there.
When we had been to Governor's Island as a family with me, Jenny, and Chris, and then your first trip with Neil was back to New York. It's kind of neat.
Right, it was.
And Ruthie and I had traveled together in Mexico at least twice. We'd gone to Mexico City.
We'd gone to Puebla, we'd gone to Merida.
And Oaxaca.
And Oaxaca, yep.
So we had traveled in Mexico, and of course a huge advantage in traveling in Mexico. One, you're a 2-hour flight away, and flights are not very expensive. Costs in Mexico are less. You can, get a car and a driver for $100 a day or something. And we were interested in the Mayan culture, in, you know, the jungle, the birds, the bird watching, the archaeological sites. So I guess our first overseas trip was probably with Neil to Mexico.
I'm
So
disagreeing.
did Neil get
No.
2 trips?
No, Neil and Jason Dean have done better. The grandparents were younger then. The next trip was Jason Dean, and he went to Canada fishing with
Ah,
us.
yes. And y'all went to a different lake.
Yeah,
And
Yes.
Jim and Stan went.
yeah.
Yes.
And it was a flight, but it was a drop-in plane, but it was,
It was
45
closer.
minutes away.
Kikiwabik, I believe.
Kikiwabik, yeah,
And Andrew and Laura Michelle went.
yeah.
And Jason is an outdoor kid, and we just felt he would be, the best trip for him would be an outdoor trip. And the fishing trip, I think, was very successful. The first thing that happened with Jason, he went fishing with Jim Beluda, and they had a stringer of fish in the water. And somehow Jason neglected to tie it good to the, what do you call it, the gunnel or whatever it was. And the fish swam away.
Been there, done that. We've all done that. It's a good lesson.
He felt so bad. But Jim Beluda was wonderful, and they joked about it. And he went out the next day and went fishing again. But from that kind of low, the rest of the trip was good. And he even did, I'm sorry, but he cooked a meal.
Yeah, and
Because that was the law of the camp. Everybody had to cook a meal.
That's exactly how we like it.
Ricky had taught him to do something, so he managed cooking a meal at camp.
And fishing in Canada is, a lot of it is interactions, you know, you gotta do your share, you gotta get up, go down and just start cleaning out the boat or putting the gas in the engine or
Loading up
being there-
minnow tanks or
yeah,
whatever.
doing
Yeah.
whatever. It's just thinking about what needs to be done and doing it and getting along with the other guys. And if he breaks his pole and you've got 2, you give him your second pole, you know, and he understood that and he got along well. I think he loved Canada.
So,
And then we took Neil to Mexico.
We took Neil to Lago Bacalar, which
was that
is
the lake?
the
Yeah.
lake in southern Mexico, just a little north of Chetumal, which is right on the Belize border, which is one of the most beautiful lakes in the world, if you can believe that. But it's as blue as the Caribbean. And in the Yucatan, there are underground rivers. There are the cenotes that have water, but the water is actually moving underground. Well, they said that that entire Lake Bacalar had clean water in it every 2 weeks. The water just flowed. So
Because it was filtering through.
through.
And that's where we met Luis Tellez.
Yes,
And he
our
was
guide.
a guide and an educator, and he was interested in birds and had written a book or 2 on archaeology of the Mayans, and was interested in the stars and was great with the boy and drove and took
Yeah,
all
drove
of it.
us.
Was
Took all
that
of
the?
the
Were you at
stress.
the research camp on that trip, or was that another trip?
That was Costa Rica.
That
Okay.
was Costa Rica.
So the Neil got 2 trips.
Don't count Neil's
I'm not
trips.
counting. But it was just Neil and you all.
Yeah, that was the first one.
But then we went back with Jason Dean
Yeah, and
the next year, I
With-
think, with Neil and Jason.
they got along great. 2
They're
different
very
kids.
different.
They got along great.
And that was the trip. They were swimming and there were kayaks on the lake and you could swim in the lake, and
I was worn out.
he was back in our cabin and I was following the boys around in the water. And Jason Dean said, "Now Grandma, you don't have to worry about us. I'm 13, and Neil is 15. That's 28. We're 28.
That's great.
But I still watch them. But we just saw so much. We went to several nature reserves where we saw wild animals and birds and
Monkeys and howlers, and you hear this growling and you wonder, oh, what's that? And it's a howler monkey. And Mayan sites, some of them that were pretty isolated, not really no Resbalan, where was pretty much we had to ask in the local village, how do you get out there, you know, and
But now I'd have to go back and look at the years. We took Neil and Jason to Costa Rica. Because
also,
before we started taking the kids, we had a couple of trips to Costa Rica.
and loved it.
And what was happening in Costa Rica? Were you in the jungle or on the coast?
We did a little bit of everything. The first trip, we basically stayed in San Jose and took day trips out. Except we went to the
Who was with you?
organization
Which
for-
grandkid was with
Well,
you?
the first we did 2 trips by ourselves
Okay.
to Costa Rica. We went with the Organization of Tropical Studies, we had actually 3 sites. Neil, one was La Selva, which was in the jungle. One was the dry forest, something verde. And then there was the Wilson Biological Gardens. So we had done a couple of trips in Costa Rica, and I think we took Jason and Neil to Costa Rica and went to La Selva.
And spent several nights.
Is La Selva the research facility?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's OTS, and it's basically they have accommodations for students, faculty, and then if they have extra rooms, they'll book them to travelers or tourists. And that's, so we were in like a cabin
With bunk beds.
with bunk beds
We
and
ate
a cafeteria.
with the
and-
students and the professors.
And that's where you could see the volcanoes in the
Yes,
distance.
and the wildlife, the birds. We saw tons of animals there. And you could take night tours out, and there was a research project. They had one of the researchers, and he took the boys out, and he took, I don't know, a piece of the jungle that was basically, they roped it off and measured it, but it was maybe 9 meters by 9 meters. And then they looked at every single plant that was in that area. And in the tropics, you have much more variety than you do in the temperate forest. So, I don't know, we came up with 100 things.
And you know, there was just, some of it was pretty isolated. There was one group of students that didn't follow the directions of sleeping inside, slept on the porch. I got bit by a vampire bat, you know.
I had to have the rabies
Had to have the
shot.
rabies shots.
Good lesson to learn.
And
Yeah,
they were running around in their flip-flops, and I saw one of the Costa Rican scorpions that was about that big. I thought, geez, that's not too good. But the boys, they got along, they loved the adventure.
and we went to Arenal, the volcano. We went to another park, and I can't remember the name of it, north of San Juan, that had the nice accommodations and the walks in the mountains with the
Yeah.
waterfalls. But
Yeah.
I can't think of the name of it. But I have to say, when we were at La Selva, and we were eating dinner with the 2 boys and a couple of other couples who were about our age, and we had the nicest conversation, the 6 of us. And afterwards, the boys went off, and the man said to us, I have never seen such polite boys in my life. They talked to the adults, they looked at them, they weren't bored or it was
Playing
just,
video games or
no,
whatever.
right, they were having a nice conversation.
And
so-
you know, there's some of the silly things you remember, like we went through the cafeteria line and it said chicken and rice. I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I got up to the rice and I said, oh, not too much rice. They give me a little, and I went on, then there was the salad and wonder where the chicken was in the rice.
Ah.
And then Neil went up, and he's not big on greens. And he stood in front of the gal that was serving the salad, and she gave him a scoop. And
He was talking or
he
something.
was talking away, she gave him another scoop of salad. So I think he ended up with about 3 scoops of salad, but it was, and then how did we get into Costa Rica? We'd gone,
Well, and another part of the story is Chris said, you're not going to Central America.
yeah,
It's too
Honduras,
dangerous.
Well,
Nicaragua,
Costa Rica's not Central
El
America.
Salvador.
They speak
But
English.
Chris talked to her good friend Janine, and Janine said to her, Chris, you're making a mistake. We've been to Costa Rica, and it's fine.
Of course, the Costa Rica they'd been to would have been Cancun and
No.
Cozumel.
No, that's
Well,
Mexico.
that's Mexico, but they had been to a resort
Yeah.
in Costa Rica, which is now,
Probably.
but it's democratic, it's very safe. We just, in all our trips, we never felt.
No, it was a great trip.
So Costa Rica, so we covered Neil and Jason, and then who was the next grandkid to
Well,
go?
Josh is a month older than Maggie. But we had this thought out a little bit. Josh had always wanted to go to Yellowstone. So I don't even know, we talked about, I guess, Washington State
Or back to Mexico.
or back to Mexico. But he really wanted to go to Yellowstone. And we had thought maybe we would do London with Maggie. That was kind of in the back of our mind. And if we did London, then she would need to be a little older. So I think her trip was a year later than Josh. But again, we had a wonderful time.
But we
And that was the
went
first Yellowstone trip.
with
Yes.
Josh alone.
Right, we had not been.
No, that
Since
was our first trip. And
Jenny
we-
was 6 years old, and Ding and Jenny and I went.
And then when it sort of came time for Josh's second trip, he said, I would rather go back to Yellowstone than any place.
Ah.
So we went back to
So
Yellowstone,
Maggie-
and that's when Margaret came with us, and we traveled with Margaret and Joshua to Yellowstone with lots of
So on,
others.
on Josh's first trip, were there any kind of hiccups
Well, for
or?
one thing, we started planning a year before the trip because we knew that the lodges are full. Shortly after, you can reserve 11 months ahead and they fill up. So we had planned this and talked to Josh, but basically we made reservations as soon as we could. And if I do say so myself, planned pretty well. We stayed at Old Faithful, which is on the west side where a lot of the geysers and the fumaroles, a lot of the water features are. And then we went to Yellowstone Lake, but stayed in cabins there. And then the last place we stayed was the Roosevelt Lodge, which is where the wildlife, up at the Lamar Valley.
And y'all went early in the summer so that the
And we had a snowstorm when we were at Yellowstone Lake. And I am so crazy. We had snow pants and boots and mittens.
you were prepared.
And we went out and built a snow fort.
And there were these folks walking around in their pajamas with a blanket around. How did you know to bring that? You know?
And I knew because Ding and Jenny and I had camped there. Had you heard this story?
Yes, but tell me again.
Well, Ding was big on the outdoors.
1975 or
We took
something.
the train out to Helen, and we took the train to Bozeman. She picked us up. We saw Montana, and then we went camping in Yellowstone, and then we went to the Black Hills. Well, when we were in Yellowstone camping, we had 16 inches of snow, like the 15th of June.
Wow.
And it was wet. There was so much snow that it broke our tent polo. So there we were in a tent that had collapsed, crawling out with the 16 inches of snow on top of us. But highlights with Josh, we saw and the Vasquezes are big on wildlife and seeing wildlife.
Getting out early and seeing, and you know, they call Lamar Valley the Serengeti of the U.S. and there's
Oh, we saw moose and elk,
pronghorns and black bear and
Pronghorn.
grizzly bear and
black bear,
elk
and coyotes,
wolves. He actually got to see wolves.
and people were so nice. We didn't have the spotting scope, but people would line up where there were animals with spotting scopes, and they would let everybody come and look. And there were, I'm sure there still are, wolf watchers, people whose hobby is seeing the wolves, and they know which ones they are and what pack they are, and
Neat.
yeah, it was neat.
And then somewhere in between these kids' visits, Ruth and I, maybe for a wedding anniversary, went to London the first time.
It was our 50th, so whatever year that was, we spent a week in January. In
What year were
London.
you married?
62.
62 plus, would that be 50? Would be
Come on now, 20.
10, 12?
12?
It wasn't, no, it was before that.
But it was our first trip, and I had a week.
50, it must have been. I
And-
guess, but anyway, we had a week. That was our first Arsenal game.
And so you and Dad, sometime in the 2000s, went
Yes.
to London on your first trip.
On our first
And did you stay in hotels or?
We got a package, you know,
Virgin Travel.
Virgin Travel. They fly you over. You have, I think it was 7 days. We extended it to 2 because basically you lose a day going, lose a day coming. We were in a nice hotel,
The
nice
Houston Hilton,
Houston Hilton.
which we loved. I've got to go back and look at those dates. Had we taken Maggie
No,
before? That was after.
that was after.
But they have levels. You could get a 3-star, a 4-star, or a 5-star hotel and pay slightly
Right.
different amounts. And we had the Houston Hilton, which is on the north part of Bloomsbury, close to the British Library and the British Museum, which was an older building, somewhat, it was a wonderful place to stay. A little tattered in places, but
It's older.
older, yeah. So that was our first London trip.
And you saw your first soccer game there?
So our first
How'd you get the
Arsenal.
tickets?
Got them on, went to Craigslist, took the name out, got a hold of the guy.
And was that
It
the
was-
same guy you've been using ever since?
We
We-
changed once.
But we used him for Teddy.
Okay.
D.
Used him for Teddy.
Teddy met D. Sing.
And then subsequently, and we fell in love with London, the soccer matches, the museums,
It's a cosmopolitan
the
city.
Indian
Being able to
cuisine, and
use public transportation
zipping around town on the tube.
or the buses.
The buses,
And there was so
museums,
much to do.
Indian restaurants, and no one felt out of place because it was such a heterogeneous community. I mean, you go on the subway or the tube and there'd be 5 languages being
Right.
spoken.
You could be black,
Yeah.
Asian,
Yeah,
Indian,
turban.
white, turban.
French.
You know.
Yeah, that's neat.
And then we took Margaret to London.
And that was the first from our kids, and y'all, she was
Right.
12-ish,
Or 11.
11, 12-ish. That
And
was the
we got
first
to see
time, her
Aurora.
first time
Oh,
being
yeah.
overseas.
But that was the first apartment.
Yes.
And it was very nice. It was on Westminster Bridge Road, it was on the South Bank, but right down from Westminster Bridge. Very walkable. A nice 2-bedroom apartment in a
Yeah.
nice area. And she, the kids all were good travelers, and she was a great traveler. We did just a bunch of stuff, a lot of walking. We took her on the Ferris wheel, the
London
London
Eye.
Eye. We went to the Tower of London.
I think we saw Wicked.
We saw Wicked. And I think we saw The Tempest. It was a children's theater, but we saw a Shakespeare play. We went to it was July, as I believe. So we went to St. James's Park and Hyde Park. We took her to the Science Museum, was a big hit.
Took her to Greenwich.
Yes, we went, oh, and she loved that, the Prime Meridian and the clock that keeps time for the world and the science exhibit. And we were there 7 or 8 days. We weren't there a long time. And we found, the area that we were in, we did not find an internet cafe real quickly. So they had a branch library, and I don't think that foreigners were supposed to use it, but they let Maggie use the computer so she could email you guys.
Nice.
Yes. The trip went
Very well.
well.
And then somewhere along the line, we took Jason and Neil to Belize.
That was when we were at Bacalar. No,
No.
that was a day trip.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the Costa Rica. God, this is horrible.
Did you
We
go
did
to
go to
Belize
Belize.
for a whole trip or just a side
I
trip?
think we did go to Belize for a whole trip.
And Pook's Hill was we went to a lodge, end of the 4-wheel drive road. It was in the jungle.
And then we went to the Caribbean. We went out to an island and the boys went fishing.
Did
and
a
we
little
went
snorkeling.
Snorkeling.
It's beautiful there. I mean,
Yes,
it's like
yeah.
a different world.
And it's English speaking. So
And
it was,
we went to an archaeological site on the Nicaraguan border, was it? And the
Guatemalan border.
Guatemalan border.
You could have gone into Guatemala. Tulum, I believe, is a huge archaeological site. But we just felt Guatemala
Little
was a
dicey.
little risky, so we stayed in Belize.
Has Matthew had his trip?
London.
Okay, so tell me about Teddy and then Matthew's trip
Okay, then Maggie went back to Yellowstone
with Josh.
with Josh.
Okay.
her two trips were Yellowstone and London, and then we had balancing all this out, you know.
So
And then there
Yellowstone,
was
but
Teddy.
when Maggie went back to Yellowstone, Dad had another incident with his hip that he didn't tell anybody about.
Right, and we covered it up pretty well because I don't think the kids even realized
worried.
it. We're worried about it.
No.
He spent one day kind of quiet, but got along fine.
Turned out okay.
Yes, and with Maggie and Josh, we flew into Bozeman. They have a wonderful museum of the Rocky Mountains in Bozeman with dinosaurs and giraffes and the early horses before the Spanish, I suppose Eohippus.
We
And
took-
stayed at, I'm sorry, the bed and breakfast that had they rehabilitated wolves.
Howler's Inn.
Howler's Inn, yes. And I think with Maggie and Josh, we did about the same thing. We stayed at Old Faithful, and we always have a nice dinner at the Old Faithful Inn, and we stayed.
And we hiked a lot with those two.
Yes, we did go on. We went to Fairy Falls and Mystic Falls.
Is that the trip where there's a story about a hike and someone wanted to have some cheese and crackers and the kids wanted to sit
That
down?
was after your dad had the little hip incident. So we took a walk along the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone and I think the Upper Falls. And you follow the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and then we went inland and through some fumaroles and pots, and it
Buffalo.
it was snowing. And on the trail there were buffalo. So we of course made a wide path around
And
the
this was
buffalo.
summertime.
Yeah, it was June. and cold as the dickens and snowing. And I bet that was a 2.5 hour hike. And Neil was back in the car and it's, well, now we can have cheese and crackers again.
We saved a lot of money.
We saved a lot of money. And all three of us said, we need something hot. So we went to Canyon.
The cafeteria.
The cafeteria. And
loaded up the trays.
With
Spaghetti.
Spaghetti and soup and desserts. And we were cold and wet and ready.
And well fed by the time we got.
Well fed, but
No argument.
no, you didn't argue. And that was also the time we went to the Roosevelt Lodge, and they've got this coaches that take you out for a cowboy dinner.
Steak dinner.
Did Josh and Maggie ride the horses?
I think they went, yes, I think they
I
did.
think they took the horseback ride.
And we went in the hay wagon.
Yes, but what they didn't tell us until we got out there was the day or two before, on the way, and it was, I don't know, an hour's ride, it wasn't a long horseback ride, a bear had come out of the forest and scared the horses.
Run off.
Which some of the horses ran off with the kids gamely trying to. And if we'd known that before we let them, I don't know that we would
And they
have.
were very anxious to have everybody sign a release before we got on the wagons or the horses.
Especially the day after the bear incident.
After the bear incident, yeah. And we took Theodore to London.
Yes, and that.
And
That was an
was
extra.
fantastic.
We must have seen 6 soccer matches, or 5. We went to
We
all
saw a lot.
You guys were getting to get London down by then.
Yes.
Because you had an apartment, you had
Yeah.
the ticket, the soccer ticket
Exactly.
scalper.
Oh, and Dee at that time got us tickets to Arsenal, West Ham, Fulham, which was up then.
But you saw a Champions League game too, like Marseille or somebody.
And we saw, sadly, not a very good match, but we were at Stamford Bridge. But I think Chelsea tied Man City 1-1 or 0-0. It was really not a great game.
But he got to see Eden Hazard for the first time.
and the
yes.
stadiums and stuff.
Now, Teddy, you can tell us, and then we saw a number of plays. One of which was about World War II. Do you remember that?
Oh, good night.
Uncle Tom.
Good night, Uncle Tom.
Yeah,
Right? And I read the book before that.
yeah, it was a little sad.
But it was very
What
sad.
was his friend's name again? The one that got...
The one that died
Yeah.
in the East End when he went back to
Was that about the kids and there was the war going on?
And they sent the children from London,
His-
especially the East End, they sent them out to the country.
His mom was
Because there's less bombing in the country.
Yes, it was safer. And the main character, Uncle Tom, had had a very sad life and was kind of a recluse
Grumpy.
and grumpy. But they came into the town with these children who needed homes. And he took this boy who had been from a very sad background, although we didn't know it then. And it was a story of how he adjusted. And then what else did we see? Didn't we see another play? Was that it?
We saw museums and
We went to the National Army Museum.
How old was Teddy then?
We were 11.
Wow, 11.
Wow. And we went to the Cartoon Museum. We went to the Science Museum.
and
We
stuff
went to
that he
Ham-
wanted to do.
Yes, we went to Hampstead Heath for a walk. We loved the area that we were in. It was close to this wonderful supermarket, Waitrose, close to the tubes,
Best meal?
Carluccio's. What do you think the best meal was?
definitely Carluccio's. I had the pasta.
Yeah.
It was really good.
And we tried like fish and chips and Teddy was a little, just,
It's all fried, you know.
I don't know. Oh, we went to Masters Fish Shop. I can't remember any of the other meals. Did we take you to the Indian YMCA?
I don't know, but have you guys mentioned James Bond yet? That we saw.
Oh, we
James
saw a
No.
James Bond movie,
in
yeah.
London.
And it took place in London, so it was particularly good.
And then Chris said, what about Matthew?
It's his turn. Last of
Yeah.
the line.
Right.
And we had scheduled to spend a month in London. And Chris, and Matthew was 12.
Yes.
Okay.
So we sort of decided it might be better if Chris and Matthew come over together. And we got a we had a 2-bedroom apartment. And that was our last trip. They came over
And now
together.
it's just April 2017. When were y'all in London with Matthew? Was it 2016?
November of 2016.
So just this past November,
Yes.
you were in
Yeah.
in London with Matthew and
Matthew.
Chris.
And it worked out great. We saw Arsenal play Paris Saint-Germain.
Yes.
And then we went out to
We saw Fulham.
Fulham play. And what is that stadium?
Craven Cottage.
Craven Cottage, which is great, right on the Thames. Nice walk there. And Chris very quickly got into the rhythm of London and the zipping around on the tube, and took him to the big toy department store by herself.
Because y'all had been there and done that,
Yeah.
and you pretty much were on your own schedule, but Chris hadn't been there, and
No.
neither had Matthew.
And sometimes we would quit at dinner time and say, "This is
We're done.
This has been a long day. We're done." And she and Matthew would go out after supper.
Fantastic.
So, yes. And
How long were y'all there?
We were there
16
about,
days.
they were there.
All over 2
14.
weeks.
Yeah, 16, 17 days,
Days.
something. And I thought it would be fun to do a day trip to Paris. You get on, like Ted and I are gonna do, or we're gonna do. You get on and we did it with Margaret. You get on the Eurostar in the morning, 5, 6 o'clock, 2.5 hours, you're in Paris. You see the Louvre, you see the Eiffel Tower, and then have a nice meal and you come back at night. Chris said, well, that sounds like fun, but maybe we should spend the night. Well, we
Agreed.
ended up
I
spending-
agree completely.
We ended up spending what, 2
2
nights?
nights.
Two
Good,
nights, 3
fantastic.
days. And we, just.
Saw
did
the
a lot of
Louvre
stuff.
and the Orsay, probably.
Did a lot in Paris.
we
And we got a guide, a woman who was an art major, took us to the Louvre, and then took us to Saint-Chapelle.
Saint-Chapelle and
So it was,
a chocolate shop. So we're
yeah,
gonna
and the chocolate shop,
do that with Ted.
so.
And Neil, the plays we saw. Oh, the Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Neil, the trip planner, got tickets to both parts of the Harry Potter plays. So we saw Harry Potter in
And the
London.
Cursed Child.
Yes, Harry
We saw
Potter.
that. Which Margaret and Theodore are going to see when they visit us
July.
in July. Have tickets for that.
That's the next trip.
That's the next trip.
It's gonna be good.
Next trip is July this year, and we're going to Edinburgh and then meet up with Chase and Maggie in Edinburgh for a day or two, hopefully, and then we're going to go back to London to the apartment on Guildford Street, and we got 2 or 3 days with Margaret, and then Teddy's going to fly in. They're going to see Harry Potter, and then Ted is going to be with us for another week or two, and we're going to go mudlarking, looking for treasure along the Thames foreshore, and
It's good to be a Libby
Plays.
grandkid.
the only, it's going to be, football is going to be tough in July, but I've got I'm checking out some preliminary games or
Practice.
under 21s
Champions,
practices, something. So we got an open weekend.
All right.
That's
It
it.
is. That is a good place to stop. I'm not sure where we're gonna go next, but we're kind of.
We don't have to.
We don't have a lot to
Are
come.
you guys gonna do another video after our trip?
I'm sure we will, but basically we're kind of coming to the end, and I don't know where we'll talk about next. But this has been
This
good.
has been good,
This
yes.
has been good, and we are now.
Now see, Teddy, I forgot some of the stuff that we had done.